The bullets had found their mark. 6 men lay dead, their blue uniforms soaking up the dust of Blackfoot territory. Samuel Hartwell was supposed to be the 7th. He'd been shot twice, his horse taken down from under him, and left for the wolves. For 3 days, that's exactly where he stayed, drifting in and out of a red haze, the names of his men catching in his throat. But on the 3rd day, he didn't die. He was found. Ayanna knelt by the creek, the water running pink over her fingers. She wasn't a friend. She wasn't a savior from some far-off fort. She was the daughter of the war chief whose men had just slaughtered Samuel's entire patrol. She'd been gathering roots when the gunshots echoed through the valley, and she'd hidden, watching her own brother ride past with 6 fresh scalps hanging from his spear. She knew exactly who this soldier was. He was the enemy, an invader, a dead man who just hadn't had the decency to stop breathing. Yet here she was, cleaning his wounds with a knowledge passed down from her grandmother. The bullet in his shoulder was bad. The one in his thigh was worse. He should be dead. But her people hadn't finished him. They had left him alive, on purpose. And that was the thing that truly terrified her. In her world, mercy like that wasn't mercy at all. It was a message. It was a warning. And this man, this broken soldier, was the terrified, breathing proof. He was delirious, muttering names in his own tongue, a language she understood perfectly but pretended not to. One name came up more than others. Mary. It was a prayer, a plea. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered to his unhearing ears. Neither should I. But it was too late for that. Finding him had already sealed her fate. She just didn't know it yet. The first time Samuel's eyes opened with any real clarity, the world was a blur of buckskin and black hair. Instinct took over. He lunged for the pistol that should have been at his hip, his hand closing on empty air. A smaller, stronger hand caught his wrist. "Be still," a voice said in perfect English. The shock of it cut through his fevered brain. He looked up, truly seeing her for the first time. The turquoise beads at her throat told him she was important. The calloused grip on his arm told him she was not to be trifled with. But then he saw it, dangling from a leather cord around her neck, a small silver locket, tarnished with dirt and blood. His breath caught in his chest. He knew that locket. He'd seen it 1,000 times in the hands of Sergeant Miller, one of the men now lying dead in the valley. A picture of Miller's wife and daughter was inside. He stared at it, then back at her face. The gentle nurse was gone. In her place was a monster, a scavenger, a ghoul who looted the dead. "Where?" he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Did you get that?" She looked down at the locket, her expression unreadable. "It was on the ground," she said, her voice calm, too calm. "The spirits must have left it for me." He didn't believe her, not for a second. This woman who had saved his life was wearing a trophy taken from his friend's corpse. Was this some kind of sick game? Was she nursing him back to health only to hand him over to her brother for a more creative death? Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but lie here helpless. But the fire in his leg and the tearing pain in his shoulder held him down like chains. He was her prisoner, and he had no idea what sentence she planned to carry out. For days they existed in that strange, silent tension. She tended his wounds, fed him broth and roasted rabbit, and never once mentioned the locket again. And he watched her, every movement, every glance, trying to piece together the puzzle of her. He learned her name was Ayanna. He learned she moved with a quiet grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. When the fever finally broke, he found his voice again. He told her about the farm, about the debt his father left behind, about the sister, Mary, whose letters he kept in his breast pocket. Letters Ayanna had found, soaked in his blood, and carefully dried by her small hidden fire. "I never wanted this," he told her, his voice raw. "I'm not a soldier. I'm a farmer. I joined the army to keep my sister from being thrown off our land." He watched her face for any sign of pity or contempt. He found neither, only a deep, unnerving stillness. She listened, and then she delivered a blow more stunning than any bullet. "My brother," she said, her voice quiet, "leads the war party that found you. His name is Dakota." The world tilted on its axis. The man who had ordered his death was this woman's brother. The locket around her neck suddenly felt like a hangman's noose. It wasn't a trophy she'd found. It was a gift. Why? He whispered, the single word holding all the fear and confusion in his soul. Why are you helping me? She finally looked at him, her dark eyes seeing straight through to the frightened boy beneath the torn uniform. I was married once, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. He was a good man, a warrior. He was killed in a raid 2 winters ago. When he died, I thought my heart had turned to stone. She paused, her gaze dropping to his wounded leg. But when I saw you in the valley, left for the wolves, something inside that stone cracked. The spirits told me, not this one, not today. Before he could process the enormity of what she was saying, a new sound cut through the air. Hoofbeats, fast, and getting closer. Ayana was on her feet in an instant, her eyes wide with a fear she hadn't shown before. It's him, she hissed. It's Dakota. She grabbed him by his good arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Get behind the rocks. Now, do not move. Do not breathe. If he finds you, we are both dead. He scrambled, the pain in his legs screaming, and wedged himself into a narrow crevice as the riders burst around the bend in the creek. There were 4 of them, their faces painted for war. The man in the lead was tall and imposing, his eyes sweeping the campsite with the intensity of a hawk. He was the man from Samuel's nightmares, the man who had led the charge. Sister, he said, his voice a low growl that carried both affection and deep suspicion. What are you doing so far from the village? Ayana stood her ground, gesturing to the small leather pouch at her belt. Medicine plants, brother. Grandmother's joints ache with the morning chill. It was a plausible lie, but it felt thin, brittle. Dakota dismounted, his eyes never leaving her face. He was searching for the lie. He could smell it. We are tracking the soldier who escaped us, he said, his voice dropping. The one the spirits shielded from our final justice. His blood trail led here. He took a step closer to her, his shadow falling over the rocks where Samuel was hiding, his heart hammering against his ribs. You have seen nothing? It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, a dare. Samuel held his breath, praying she could hold the lie together. Nothing, Ayana said, her voice steady. Perhaps the wolves you left him for were hungry. A flicker of something, annoyance, doubt, crossed Dakota's face. He knew his sister. He knew the rhythms of her speech, the honesty in her eyes. And right now, all his warrior's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Show me your bag, he commanded, his voice flat. It was a test, a simple, deadly test. Ayana's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she untied the pouch and handed it over. Samuel watched through a crack in the rocks, knowing that if a single drop of his blood had stained that leather, it was over. Dakota emptied the contents into his palm. Sage, willow bark, dried berries, exactly what she'd claimed. He stared at the herbs for a long moment, then slowly poured them back into the pouch. For a heart-stopping second, Samuel thought they were safe. But then the third warrior, a young man with sharp, jealous eyes, spoke up. Dakota, he said, pointing a spear toward the camp. The fire, it is still warm, and there are 2 sets of tracks by the water, hers and another, heavier. The young warrior's name was Crow Feather. He had been trying to win Ayana's affection for years, and his eyes burned with resentment. He hadn't just seen tracks, he was looking for a rival. Dakota's head snapped up. His gaze locked onto the small fire pit, then to the disturbed earth near the creek. The air went cold. He turned back to Ayana, and this time, there was no brotherly affection in his eyes. Only the cold, hard certainty of a hunter who has cornered his prey. You lied to me, sister. He took another step forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of the knife at his belt. Where is he? Ayana didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire Samuel had never seen. I told you, she said, her voice ringing with defiance. The mountains are full of tracks, animals, spirits. You are chasing ghosts. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to use their shared beliefs against him. Dakota paused, his eyes narrowing. He wanted to believe her, but Crow Feather wasn't done. I saw more than tracks, he sneered, his gaze fixed on the rocks where Samuel was hiding. When we passed this way at sunrise, I saw the glint of metal in the shadows, like a soldier's buckle. It was over. Samuel knew it. There was no way out. Dakota took a slow, deliberate step toward the rock pile, his knife now in his hand. Samuel's own hand instinctively went to the wound in his thigh, the pain a dull throb compared to the terror that was strangling him. He could hear his own ragged breathing. He was weaponless, wounded, and trapped. He looked at Ayanna, a silent apology in his eyes. He had doomed her, but Ayanna wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her brother, a strange, sad smile on her face. "You are right, brother," she said softly. The words hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. Dakota froze, his knife half raised. Crowfeather's smug expression faltered. "There is a man here," Ayanna continued, her voice gaining strength. "A man I have sworn to protect." Dakota's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. "You would protect one of them? A blue coat? After what they have done to our people? To our lands?" "This one is different," she said. It was the simplest, most dangerous truth she could speak. "There are no different ones," Dakota roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He lunged forward, not at the rocks, but at her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Tell me where he is, or I will tear this camp apart stone by stone, and I will make you watch as I take his scalp." Samuel couldn't stay hidden, not while she was being threatened. He started to push himself out of the crevice. Pain be damned. But before he could move, a new voice cut through the tension. An old voice, cracked with age but filled with an authority that stopped even Dakota in his tracks. "That is enough, my grandson." An old woman stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a tall walking stick. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. It was Morning Star, Ayanna's grandmother. A woman so old and revered, she was considered half spirit, half human. No one, not even a war chief's son, dared to disobey her. Dakota instantly released Ayanna's arm, his head bowed in respect. "Grandmother," he said, his voice tight with frustration, "she is shielding an enemy, a murderer." Morning Star walked slowly toward the fire, her gaze sweeping over the scene. She looked at Dakota, at Crow Feather, and then her eyes settled on the pile of rocks. She looked directly at the crack where Samuel was hiding. He felt her gaze like a physical touch. "I know who is here," she said, her voice calm. She turned back to Dakota. "The spirits brought him to me in a vision 3 nights ago. They told me this soldier's life was tied to the fate of our people. They told me he was not to be harmed." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Samuel watched in stunned silence as Dakota and the other warriors reeled back, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. To question a vision from Morning Star was to question the spirits themselves. It was unthinkable. "A vision?" Dakota stammered. "Grandmother, he is a blue coat. His hands are stained with the blood of our cousins." "And our hands?" Morning Star countered, her voice sharp. "Are they clean? This war has stained us all, grandson. The spirits seek a new path. This man is the first step." She turned and pointed her walking stick directly at Samuel's hiding place. "Come out, soldier. It is time." Slowly, painfully, Samuel pulled himself from the crevice. He leaned against the rock, his torn uniform and pale face a stark contrast to the warriors around him. He met Dakota's eyes, seeing pure, undiluted hatred there. Crow Feather looked like he wanted to spit, but they were held in check by the old woman's power. They could not defy a spiritual command. "You will come with me," Morning Star said, her words directed at Samuel but meant for everyone. "You will stay in my cabin until your wounds are healed. The spirits have spoken. Ayanna has only done as I commanded." She had, in one brilliant move, taken all the blame, all the suspicion, and placed it on her own sacred shoulders. She had given Ayanna a shield that not even Dakota could break. Dakota stared at his grandmother, then at his sister, his face a storm of conflict. He had been outmaneuvered. He couldn't kill a man protected by the spirits, not without bringing a curse upon himself and his family. He let out a frustrated hiss, like air from a punctured lung. "As you say, grandmother," he bit out. He turned to his warriors. "We ride." He swung himself onto his horse, shot one last venomous glare at Samuel, and galloped away, Crowfeather and the others close behind. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, the tension broke. Ayana rushed to Samuel's side, helping him stand. Morningstar watched them, her ancient eyes filled with a deep sadness. "That was a temporary solution, children," she said, her voice losing its commanding tone and becoming weary. "A lie, even a holy one, cannot hold a warrior like Dakota for long. He will look for a way to prove my vision false, and when he does, he will come for you." Samuel looked from Ayana to her grandmother, a wave of gratitude and dread washing over him. They had saved his life, but they had also just started a new, more dangerous war. One fought not with guns but with faith and lies. And it was a war they were almost certain to lose. "There is only one path for you now," Morningstar said, her voice grave. "You cannot stay here. You cannot go back to your own people. There is only one direction left: north. Canada." The word hung in the air between them. A different country, a different life. It seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. "He can't travel," Ayana protested, gesturing to Samuel's leg. "He can barely stand." "He must," Morningstar said, her tone final, "because my grandson is not the only one who is suspicious. Crow Feather saw more than he let on. He is young and foolish, but his jealousy gives him sharp eyes. He will not let this go. He will watch. He will wait. And he will convince Dakota to defy me." The journey to Morningstar's cabin was a blur of agony. It was only 2 hours away, nestled in a hidden valley, but for Samuel it felt like 100 miles. Every step on his wounded leg sent a shockwave of pain through his body. He leaned heavily on Ayana, his weight a burden she accepted without complaint. He could feel the eyes of unseen watchers on them the entire time. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like an approaching warrior. He knew Morningstar was right. Dakota had accepted her decree, but he hadn't believed it. He was letting them go for now, but he was also letting them lead him. He was tracking them. The cabin was small and weathered, smoke curling from its mud and stick chimney. It smelled of cedar and drying herbs and felt like the safest place in the world. Morningstar immediately set to work, her old gnarled hands moving with the practiced skill of a lifelong healer. She cleaned his wounds again, applying a poultice of chewed leaves that soothed the burning pain. "My granddaughter did good work," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "But the body is the easy part. It is the heart that is now in danger." She settled by the fire, gesturing for them to sit. The air in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken words. "You love him," she said to Ayana. It was a statement, not a question. Ayana simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. "And you, soldier," Morningstar said, turning her sharp gaze on Samuel. "You love my granddaughter, a woman your people would call a savage." "Yes," Samuel said, his voice clear and steady. "I do." Morningstar let out a long, slow breath. "Love in a time of war," she whispered. "It is the most beautiful and the most deadly flower. It can save your soul, or it can get you killed." She stared into the flames, her eyes distant, as if seeing a past no one else could. "I have seen this before," she said softly. She rose and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner, a chest Samuel hadn't noticed before. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath a pile of dried furs, was not what he expected to see. There were no tribal artifacts or medicine bundles. Instead, there was a stack of old yellowed books, their spines cracked with age. And something else. A small frame photograph, the image faded and sepia-toned. She lifted the photograph and brought it to the firelight. It showed a younger morning star, her face unlined and proud. Standing next to her was a white man with a thick mustache and kind eyes, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He was wearing the uniform of a United States cavalry scout. Samuel stared at the picture, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Ayana gasped, her eyes wide with shock. She had never seen this picture before. She had never known. "His name was John," Morningstar said, her voice thick with memory. "John Tanner, my husband." The secret hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Morning Star, the revered elder, the keeper of their people's traditions, had been married to a white man, a soldier. "He was a good man," she continued, her fingers tracing the faded image of his face. "He saw me as a woman. Not as an Indian. We were happy, for a time. Her face darkened. But our worlds could not stay apart. My people saw him as a traitor. His people saw me as a squaw. When the fighting grew worse, he was forced to choose. He chose his uniform. He left, promising to come back for me. He never did. I later heard he was killed in an ambush by the Cheyenne. She looked up from the photograph, her eyes burning with an ancient pain. I tell you this not to share my sorrow, but to share my wisdom. A love like yours cannot survive here. This land is poisoned by hate. Dakota is my grandson, and I love him. But his heart has been hardened by this war. He will never accept you, soldier. He will see you as the man who stole his sister, and he will hunt you to the ends of the earth. She reached back into the chest and pulled out two objects. The first was a heavy leather pouch that jingled with the sound of coin. The second was a set of folded yellowed papers. "This is gold," she said, handing the pouch to Samuel. "Enough to buy horses, supplies, and a new life where no one knows your faces." Then she handed the papers to Ayanna. "And these," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "are my marriage lines, signed by a missionary at Fort Benton. The white man's law will see them as proof that such a thing is possible. It may offer you some protection." Ayanna took the papers as if they were sacred scrolls. She looked at her grandmother, her eyes filled with 1,000 questions. "Grandmother, why did you never tell me?" "Because that part of my life was a ghost," Morningstar said sadly, "and I did not want its shadow to fall on you. But now my ghost may be the only thing that can save you." A sudden sound from outside made them all freeze. The sharp, piercing cry of a night hawk. But it wasn't a hawk. It was a signal. Morningstar moved to the small window, peering out into the darkness. "It has begun," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "Crow Feather, he is out there. I saw his shadow pass the moon. He is watching the cabin. Dakota sent him. They are waiting for you to make a mistake." The safe, warm cabin suddenly felt like a trap. The walls were closing in. "You must go," Morningstar said, turning from the window, her eyes blazing. "You must go now. Tonight. There is a path behind the cabin, through the Crying Wolf caves. It is treacherous, but it is the only way they will not think to look." The escape was a nightmare. The caves were a twisting labyrinth of cold, damp rock. They moved in total darkness, Ayanna leading the way, her hand never leaving Samuel's. His leg was a constant, throbbing agony, but he bit down on the pain and kept moving, his mind focused on the image of Dakota's face, twisted with hate. They traveled for what felt like days. Their only food, the dried meat Morningstar had pressed into their hands. Their only water, the icy drips from the cave ceiling. When they finally emerged, blinking in the pale light of dawn, they were miles away from the cabin, high in the mountains. They were free, but they were also completely alone, hunted by everyone they had ever known. Their journey north was a brutal test of survival. They moved only at night, hiding during the day in thickets and caves. Ayanna was in her element. She moved through the wilderness with a silent confidence that amazed Samuel. She could read the stars like a map, find food where he saw only rocks and weeds, and sense danger long before it appeared. She was no longer just the woman who had saved him. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting for their shared future. He, on the other hand, was a liability. His leg healed slowly, the limp a permanent reminder of his weakness. He was a soldier without a gun, a farmer without a field. He depended on her for everything, and the guilt of it ate at him. One night, as they sheltered from a freezing rain beneath an overhang of rock, the weight of it all became too much. "Do you ever regret this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Leaving everything, your family, your home, for me." Ayanna was silent for a long time, staring out into the storm. "I regret the pain I have caused my grandmother," she said finally. "I regret that my brother will forever see me as a traitor." She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning. "But you?" she said, moving closer and taking his hand. "I could never regret you. You are my home now." But they weren't just being hunted by Dakota. They were being hunted by the army. A week into their journey, they stumbled upon a smoldering campfire. Scattered around it were tracks from shod horses, a lot of them, and something else, a discarded notice, nailed to a tree. It described a deserter, Private Samuel Hartwell. Last seen in Blackfoot territory, believed to be a captive, or to have turned traitor and joined with the enemy. A reward was offered for his capture, dead or alive. The news hit him like a physical blow. His own people, the army he had joined to save his family, now saw him as a traitor. They were caught in an impossible vice. To the Blackfoot, he was an enemy soldier. To the army, he was an enemy collaborator. There was no one on their side, no one in the world but each other. The close call came 2 days later. They were crossing a wide open prairie at dusk when Ayanna suddenly pulled him down behind a line of sagebrush. "Soldiers," she whispered, pointing to a ridge a mile to the east. A U.S. cavalry patrol, at least 20 men, was moving along the ridgeline, their blue uniforms stark against the setting sun. They were moving in a search pattern. They were looking for him. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. A part of him, the soldier part, wanted to stand up, to wave his arms to surrender. But he knew what would happen. He'd be court-martialed, hanged as a traitor. And Ayanna? They would see her as a savage captor and kill her without a second thought. They lay flat in the sagebrush for hours, not daring to move, as the patrol swept back and forth across the prairie. At one point, a scout rode to within 100 yards of their hiding place. Samuel could see the man's face, the exhaustion and frustration etched there. He held his breath, every muscle tense. The scout paused, his horse sniffing the air. He looked in their direction, his eyes scanning the landscape. For a terrifying moment, Samuel was sure he'd been seen. But then the scout seemed to decide it was nothing, just a trick of the fading light. He wheeled his horse around and rode back to join the main patrol. As darkness fell, the soldiers made camp, their fires twinkling like malevolent stars on the horizon. They were trapped. "We can't stay here," Samuel whispered. "They'll find us in the morning." "There is one way," Ayanna said, her voice grim, "but it is dangerous." She pointed to the west, where a sheer rock cliff rose hundreds of feet into the air. The old ones called it the Spirit Wall. They say no man can climb it, but there is a legend, a hidden path used by hunters in my great-grandfather's time, a series of narrow ledges. If the path is still there, it will take us over the ridge behind the soldiers. It was a crazy risk. In the dark, on a sheer cliff face, with his bad leg, one slip, and they would both be dashed on the rocks below. But looking at the army campfires, he knew it was their only chance. "I trust you," he said. The climb was the most terrifying experience of Samuel's life. The path was barely a path at all, just a series of handholds and footholds carved into the rock face, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. The wind howled around them, trying to tear them from the cliff. Below them, there was only blackness. Samuel's legs screamed in protest, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. More than once, his foot slipped, and he was saved only by Ayanna's iron grip on his arm. She moved like a mountain goat, sure-footed and fearless, guiding him, encouraging him, willing him onward. When they finally reached the top, they collapsed, their bodies shaking, their lungs burning. They had made it. They were alive. They looked back and saw the army campfires far below, a world away. They had escaped the army, but they had forgotten about their other hunter. They found a shallow cave to rest in, huddled together for warmth as the temperature plummeted. Samuel was just drifting into an exhausted sleep when Ayanna stiffened beside him. "Someone is here," she whispered, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. Samuel sat up, his heart instantly racing. He listened, but heard nothing but the wind. "How do you know?" "I can smell him," she said, her voice a low growl. "Wood smoke and resentment." And then a figure appeared at the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He was alone, armed with a bow and a quiver of arrows. It was Crow Feather. His face was a mask of triumphant hatred. "I knew it," he hissed, his eyes fixed on Ayanna. "I knew the old woman lied. I followed you. Dakota would not listen, but I knew. You chose this white dog, over your own people, over me." He raised his bow. An arrow knocked and aimed directly at Samuel's heart. "Now," Crow Feather sneered, I will bring Dakota the scalp he was denied. And I will bring you home, Ayana. You will be my wife. You will forget this filth ever existed. Ayana moved so fast Samuel barely saw it. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She attacked. She launched herself at Crow Feather, her knife flashing. He was bigger and stronger, but he was caught by surprise. They tumbled out of the cave, rolling on the narrow ledge, a tangle of desperate limbs. Samuel scrambled after them, his bad leg making him clumsy. Crow Feather threw Ayana off, and she slammed against the rock wall, the knife skittering from her grasp. He turned back to Samuel, his eyes burning with murder. He drew another arrow, taking aim at point-blank range. This was it. There was no escape. But as Crow Feather drew back the bowstring, Ayana, dazed but not defeated, did the only thing she could. She grabbed a loose rock the size of her fist and threw it with all her might. It struck Crow Feather in the side of the head. He staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face. The arrow flew wide, clattering harmlessly against the cave wall. He stumbled backward, his arms windmilling for balance. For a terrible, frozen moment, he teetered on the edge of the cliff. Then with a strangled cry, he was gone. He disappeared into the blackness below. Silence. The only sound was the wind, howling its mournful song. Ayana stared at the spot where Crow Feather had been, her face pale, her body trembling. She hadn't meant to kill him. She had just been trying to save Samuel. But it didn't matter. The result was the same. She had killed one of her own people, a man from her tribe, a warrior who had wanted to be her husband. There was no going back now. Not ever. She was no longer just a traitor in spirit. She was a killer, an outcast. Samuel went to her, wrapping his arms around her as she began to sob, her body shaking with grief and horror. They had survived again, but the price was getting higher every time. 3 weeks later, they crossed the border. It wasn't marked by a fence or a guard post, just a simple stone marker that read, Dominion of Canada. The air didn't feel different. The trees didn't look different. But for them, everything had changed. The weight of being hunted, a pressure that had been crushing them for weeks, finally lifted. They were safe. They were free. Ayana stood at the marker for a long time, looking south, back toward the mountains that held everything she had ever known and lost. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then she turned her back on it and walked north, toward her new life. They were married in a small settlement called New Eden by a traveling Methodist minister who asked no questions. The ceremony was witnessed by the minister's wife and a fur trapper who was just passing through. Ayana wore a simple dress of blue calico, a gift from the minister's wife. Samuel used a small nugget from Morningstar's pouch to trade for a simple gold band. When the minister asked, "Do you, Samuel Hartwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Samuel looked at Ayana, at the impossible strength and courage in her eyes, and said, "I do," with more certainty than he had ever felt about anything in his life. When it was her turn, she said yes, her voice quiet but firm, a promise not just to him, but to the new world they were building together, a world far from the ghosts of their past. They settled in a remote valley near the foothills of the Rockies. Samuel, with his farmer's hands and knowledge of horses, found work easily on a local ranch. Ayana, with her grandmother's knowledge of herbs and healing, became the unofficial doctor for the small community. People talked, of course. A former American soldier and his Indian wife were a curiosity. But here, north of the border, the old hatred seemed less important. A person was judged more on the strength of their back and the honesty of their word. They built a small cabin with their own hands, by a creek that sang the same song as the one where they had first met. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. For the first time, they felt a sense of peace. On their first wedding anniversary, they sat by that creek as the sun went down. The year had been a good one. They had worked hard, saved a little money, and made a place for themselves. Samuel had never been happier. He watched his wife, her long black hair catching the last rays of sunlight, and felt a love so fierce it almost hurt. Ayana turned to him, a small, secret smile on her face. She took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. He felt a small, distinct flutter against his palm. He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. "Come spring," she said softly, "there will be three of us." He pulled her into his arms, bearing his face in her hair, overwhelmed with a joy so pure it felt like a miracle. They had lost everything to be together, but now they were about to create a whole new world of their own. But ghosts have long shadows. A few months later, a letter arrived. It was from his sister Mary, the first word he'd had from her in over a year. He tore it open, his hands shaking with excitement and relief. But as he read, the joy drained from his face, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. The news was not good. The men his father had owed money to had not forgotten the debt. With Samuel gone, declared a deserter, they had come to collect. They had taken the farm, everything. Mary, only 16, had been left with nothing. She was now living with a distant aunt, working as a hired girl. The safe place he had sacrificed everything to protect was gone. His plan had failed. His sister was suffering because he had chosen love, chosen to run. The life he had built with Ayana suddenly felt fragile, selfish, bought with his sister's happiness. He didn't tell Ayana at first. He carried the letter with him for days, the crinkled paper a constant, bitter reminder of his failure. He grew quiet, distant. Ayana knew something was wrong. She had seen that haunted look in his eyes before, back at the creek when he was still her wounded enemy. Finally, one evening, she confronted him. "What is it, Samuel? What shadow has fallen on you?" He couldn't hide it from her anymore. He gave her the letter. She read it slowly, her face growing sad. When she finished, she didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't blame him. She simply folded the letter, took his hand and said, "Then we will bring her here." He stared at her. "Here? To Canada? How? We have nothing." "We have each other," she said, her voice filled with a fierce determination. "We have this land. We have a child coming. We will work harder. We will save every penny. We will send for your sister. Family is family. It does not matter what color their skin is or which side of a line they were born on." In that moment, he loved her more than ever. She had lost her entire family, her entire world, but her heart was still big enough to make room for his. Years passed. They worked, they saved, and they sent for Mary. She arrived, a pale, quiet girl who had seen too much hardship, but in the clean mountain air, in the warmth of her brother's home, she began to heal. Their son, John, named for the ghost in Morningstar's photograph, grew strong and tall, a perfect blend of his two worlds, with his father's brown eyes and his mother's black hair. He grew up hearing stories of two peoples, learning the ways of both the farm and the forest. The cabin became a home, filled with love and laughter. The ghosts of the past seemed, finally, to be at rest. But one day a stranger rode into the valley. He was an old fur trapper, his face weathered like ancient leather. He was passing through, heading south into the territories. He stayed with them for a night, sharing stories by the fire. He spoke of the changes to the south, the reservations, the last of the free tribes being forced to surrender. He mentioned the Blackfoot. He had traded with them for years. Iana listened, her face a stoic mask, but Samuel could see the pain in her eyes. "I knew a warrior named Dakota," the trapper said, puffing on his pipe. "A great leader, but a heart full of rage, especially after his sister betrayed them. Ran off with a soldier. It broke his spirit, they say." The trapper shook his head sadly. "It also made him reckless. He led a raid against a Crow war party a few years back. It was a foolish fight. He was killed." Ayana flinched, a small, sharp intake of breath. Her brother was dead. The man who had hunted her, who had hated her, was gone. Samuel reached for her hand under the table. She squeezed it, her knuckles white. The trapper, oblivious, continued. "Funniest thing about that whole story," he mused. "Years later, I was sharing a drink with one of Dakota's old warriors. He told me why they left that soldier alive in the first place, the one the sister ran off with." Samuel and Ayana both froze, their eyes locked on the old man. "It wasn't mercy," the trapper chuckled. "Dakota was smart. He wanted the army to find that soldier, broken, half dead, the lone survivor. He wanted it to be a message, a symbol of their power, a warning to any other blue coats who thought of crossing into their lands. He left him alive to spread fear." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The truth, held secret for all these years. It was a truth more terrible than anything Samuel could have imagined. Ayanna hadn't just saved the life of an enemy. She had undone her brother's entire plan. She hadn't just betrayed him by falling in love. She had actively sabotaged his strategy, his authority as a war leader. Her act of compassion, the very thing that had brought them together, was the deepest, most profound betrayal of all. In saving Samuel's life, she had in a way helped to kill her own brother. The trapper left the next morning. Samuel and Ayanna stood on their porch, watching him ride away. The beautiful valley, their peaceful home, suddenly felt different, haunted. They had built a new life, a good life. They had a family. They had love. But it was all built on a foundation of blood and betrayal, and a secret that would now bind them together forever. Ayanna looked out at the mountains, the ones that looked so much like the ones she left behind. "He hated me," she whispered, her voice choked with a grief she thought she had buried long ago. "And he died hating me." "He died loving you too," Samuel said softly, pulling her close. "Hate was just the only way he knew how to show it after you were gone." She leaned against his chest, the solid, steady beat of his heart, a comfort against the storm in her own. They had survived war, survived being hunted, survived starting over in a new land. They would survive this too. Their love was a bridge, built between two worlds that had tried to tear them apart. It was a bridge that had cost them everything, and it was a bridge that was strong enough to hold them, even with the weight of all their ghosts. The warrior and the soldier were gone. In their place stood a man and a woman, a family, a testament to the idea that sometimes the only thing worth fighting for is each other. If their story of impossible love and the high price of peace moved you, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore the lines that divide us and the love that refuses to be broken.